Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Classroom Chronicles with myself, Ben White, and very shortly, our guest for today, Dan Borman. So while Dan is joining the show, I'll kick off with the introduction. So as listeners from last time may recall, my name is Ben White. I'm currently an assistant head teacher. I teach psychology and sociology, and I've got a background in education and research and writing. This year, I'm working part-time, and I freed up myself one day a week to do things that I find interesting, that I want to invest time in. So that includes improving teaching, exploring tech and teaching, working on what to do about phones in schools and the impact that social media has on young people. And also I'm getting into stories. So I really enjoy telling stories and engaging in stories and thinking about the role that stories play in schools. And that's what inspired this podcast, which is an attempt to share stories from the classroom with teachers and others who work in schools. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Borman. So Dan is an exceptional chemistry teacher. He came into teaching after a stint as an ethical hacker for a large consultancy firm. He's played a lot of cricket and briefly gained notoriety around, I think, 2007 as the bass guitar and occasional vocals for Maidstone-based band Brigadier Ambrose, who, I've done some deep digging here, had a 2007 release called Decembered, which was Radcliffe and Macaulay's single of the week. Dan, with Phil Hewinson and a chancellor called Ben White, also co-created an education app in 2018 called Compare and Learn that tried to bring comparative judgment to the classroom. Welcome aboard, Dan. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me along.
That's great. It's been a good show. I hope you've enjoyed it. As you're here, we may ask you a few questions. So if you can just tarry for 50 minutes or so. Before we get into the show itself, just a reminder that it's brought to us with the support of our sponsors. First of all shows are brought to us with our sponsorship from John Capp Educational, who publish professional development books and resources that support teaching and learning in schools around the world. You can level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles. And if you use the code JCTTR2425, then you get 20% off your order. And you're still in time, if you haven't yet secured tickets, to attend Teachers Talk Connect, where you have a chance to join the Teachers Talk radio team in Manchester on Saturday, the 1st of March, for Teachers Talk Connect, the biggest free event we've run so far. There will be a chance to hear from main stage speakers, including Lee Parkinson, who's known on social media as Mr. P, Kate Jones, and Vic Goddard. And there is a range of subject-specific CPD and phase-specific CPD as well. And obviously a great chance to network with other teachers. You can get tickets for free if you're a teacher or leader, and you can find out more about that on ttradio.org. So you can sign up and get your ticket. We'll hear again from them later. But for now, let's return to the premise of the show. So this is Chalkboard Chronicles. If you're a regular listener, which would involve having listened last time, then you'll know the premise, which is we explore fascinating stories with people working across the school system. But in case this is your first show, here's the elevator pitch of it. So, stories first. They require, like an engaging story, requires a character, a predicament, and then some kind of extrication from that challenge. So that's Jonathan Gottschall in The Storyteller Animal boils stories down just to this. And that applies to stories we read, so films, book, TV shows, but also to the ones we tell ourselves about ourselves. So all of us do that to some degree, some of us more than others. We constantly tell a story about our day, our week, our year. And then schools, like any complex social organization, kind of like story-making factories, as Martin Griffin mentioned in our last show. So the premise of this would be each day, students and staff are presented with a series of challenges or predicaments that they will either try to navigate successfully, try to navigate unsuccessfully, or fail to try to navigate at all. And as these days, or you could think of them like episodes, get repeated, kind of like if you have a favourite drama or crime show, those stories reveal more and more about the central character. But obviously, in the stories we tell in schools, that's us. Dan, this is when I pause and ask the guest, what am I talking about?
Well, that was long, wasn't it? So yeah, the question of stories in school. Yeah, I think it is interesting in the sense that every teacher I speak to has their own story, which I always find intriguing, because schools often have an ethos that's printed somewhere and official. But when you speak to teachers one-to-one, they all have their own story. So yeah, I think from my perspective, why I'm in teaching, if you like, I really like learning to the point of possibly being a bit sad about it. The classroom environment, young people getting cleverer, enjoying the subject, gaining confidence in the subject. That hour, and not all lessons are spectacular, but that hour can be a really amazing hour. So I think my personal story at the moment, I'm trying to maximize how much teaching I do, which is by far my favorite bit. And the sort of other side of things, I'm trying to minimize the rest of what I do in school, because I naturally find that slightly less interesting. But I think I'm fairly confident if you put me in a room with some young learners, we'll learn some science and we'll have some fun.
Thank you. That's a fantastic start. And I think we're going to circle around that premise, which is you're quite driven to teach as well as you can. And because I've worked with you in different contexts, often hear frustration with some of the other things that go on around a school. And we're going to revisit that a bit later. One of the themes that came up in our last show, when we were talking with Martin, he talked about frustrating stories. So I think actually the internet thinks, we're not sure. Philip Larkin may have said that most stories, like the bad ones, they have a beginning and then a muddle and then they just end because there's too many threads in them. There's not a clear plot. There's things that are left unresolved. And I've written a bit about this because it really stuck with me from last time, living in the muddle. But it feels like sometimes schools can be like that. So I find in my role sometimes that rather than being like that TV drama, do this thing, effectively, end of story, there's just a series of demands that open up as you go through the day. Then the day ends. Do you see like muddles in the schools that you work in and visit?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's true. And everyone is obviously, due to the nature of schools, very well-meaning and trying really hard on their little bit of that system, I suppose. So yeah, I think that where the muddle comes in, you've got the practical muddle where everyone's possibly doing everything slightly differently and possibly at cross purposes. And then you've got the muddled thinking, which may be the first bit before we get to the manifestations of the muddled actions. So yeah, I enjoyed speaking to teachers, but when I'm in a more mischievous mood, I can usually gently trip them up within about 3 stages of logic. So if you ask a teacher what they're trying to do in a given lesson or a given day, and you just ask polite questions about why they're doing it and how they're doing it, within about 2 or 3 steps, they'll often have gone off on a tangent which had no relation to the first bit, because perhaps the muddle is because teachers are overloaded, have lots of things in their mind, and it's very difficult in a school to just focus on that one thing because your attention is being drawn in so many different directions.
So it's fair to say this can come across as a little controversial. And I think what you're saying is that teachers in schools, and probably me some of the time, we're doing things that we don't really know really what we're trying to do or how we're going to do it. Is that fair? And if it is, can you give an example? So boil it down to the things you see teachers doing and describing. You think, actually, that's not as clear as perhaps they assume.
Yeah, I think, well, if we take a sort of teaching example in a classroom environment, so you can you can see the will of a teacher. Let's say a teacher's trying to explain to students how important an idea is, and they really should know it for the exam, or just they should know it because that's what's being taught. And then potentially just going into sort of panic mode because obviously it's very hard to judge if 25, 30 young people have all grasped an idea. As many people have pointed out, you can't look inside a young person's brain and see what's going on. Everything we're doing is inference based on what students are giving us back. So that is very much out of our control. So teachers, I suspect, and lots of teachers I've observed, resort to what they can control, which is make sure you copy that down correctly, or tell the person next to you what we've just learnt, and then not checking in again, and then thinking, oh, that's true, I told them that thing, I better tell them the next thing. And potentially teachers end up in this cycle of desperately wanting the young people to learn everything they're teaching, but because they can't guarantee the students have learnt it, they resort to very indirect methods. Oh, we've got an exercise book full of writing here, or there's a test that a student did 3 years ago and they got 18 out of 20. So I think that's perhaps where the muddle comes in, and teachers perhaps have to be, if this is in a classroom, have to be perhaps just a bit more relaxed in that you don't know the students know it all. It is largely out of your control. You can do things that will improve the probability that young people will learn something. But yeah, I think that's where the muddle comes in. How do you get young people to learn? How do you prove that they've learned it? And I think a lot of teachers get stuck in the trying to make it look like learning's happened.
Let's try and break that bit down, because I think I find when I speak with you about teaching, sometimes I agree immediately. Sometimes I think, no, that's frankly quite insulting. I know what I'm doing. And then a few weeks later, it clicks. So this one example of this was when you first started, initially I would say bleating about, because I didn't like the sound of it at first, and then it became clear about writing things down. So there's this tendency in secondary schools for books need to be neat and contain information, and students revise them later, etc., etc. And I think probably of all the people I speak to about teaching, you've been talking for the longest about, well, that's not the best way to do it. Can you tell us a bit about writing things down and why it's maybe not a good thing to get students to do?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So very specifically, in my opinion, and there's some research to back it up, that transcribing, copying from the board onto their book, from a book onto their exercise book, is just a royal waste of time, potentially. And some research goes further and says students, when they do copy something down, actually concentrate less than if they were just listening to the teacher, because we're sort of naturally efficient people. So a young person, if they're told to write it down, they will write it down, usually quite passively. They'll be thinking, well, I don't need to concentrate on this. I wrote it down, so I've got a kind of backup, and I'll learn that fact at some indeterminate point in the future, which of course they never will, or they do it the night before when they're cramming for a test. So most teachers I speak to, understandably, are concerned about how much time they have to teach. They don't have enough lessons, and then proceed to potentially spend a good half of the lessons with students copying information from one place to the other. And there's lots of research that suggests that doing anything other than that would be better. So if you really want young people to know something important, I would just give it to them. However that is, give them a paper copy, an electronic copy, and then you can spend your lesson time learning it, explaining it, trying to recall it from memory, having a class discussion, writing it out without looking, retrieval practice, which we all know is really super effective for learning. So yeah, I'm pretty anti-transcribing, and especially since the dawn of the internet now, everything the student ever needs is written down somewhere. So the idea of, I'm a bit older now, when I was at school, if I didn't copy down the notes, I was done for, because that was the only place those notes existed. But now there are thousands of versions of the notes that young people need. So yes, I'm pretty much anti-copying, I would say.
Okay, so there's a few things in there as well. So trying to make this as concrete as possible for our listeners. It may be the premise is something we agree with. It may not be, but we don't want people to transcribe things. We want to give them information as clearly as possible. Then we're going to get them to learn the information. And then there's just a series of things that get it to stick. Can you give us an example of how that fits in a lesson? So try and be as concrete as possible. Say, well, when I'm teaching this thing, this is what we do.
Yeah, so my sort of default model would be if there's a key concept, let's say that I'm trying to teach young people in chemistry or science, I just tell them. I avoid the sort of 10 minutes at the start of the lesson asking what they think, because in all fairness, if I ask them what an atom is, they might discuss it, they may share a lot of incorrect ideas, and I'm going to tell them what an atom is afterwards anyway. So the model I sort of follow is I explain the idea as clearly as possible. I then might have it written down on the board for the students to look at. At some point, though, fairly quickly after that explanation, everything goes blank, and I ask the students either to explain it to each other without looking at any notes, or perhaps trying to describe it for themselves without looking at any notes. Then we check to see how close they were, if they're on the way to learning that key idea. Then I'll probably try another approach, again, with retrieval in mind. So they perhaps apply that knowledge to an idea, or retrieve it in a different style. And then the longer term plan, I mean, from my perspective, that would be sort of learning moment number one. And I'd like to do that within 5 or 10 minutes, really. And then, of course, young people are going to forget these things. The idea of, oh, I've said that once, you'll remember it forever, is obviously nonsense. So because I've taught that bit quite quickly, I've been quite concise, I haven't wasted time, and I've been very clear, that buys me 5 or 6 further retrieval attempts later in the term or later across the year. And of course, in terms of all the stuff I've removed potentially from traditional teaching, they didn't copy it out for the sake of it. I didn't ask them to share their ignorance about the idea before I told them what the idea was. And that's where you can buy some time back. And that's sort of the cycle I follow. Explain it as quickly as possible, ask them to explain it back to me, or explain it in written format in their books, and then just repeat, really. So I think that's how, from a concrete perspective, that's what I would do.
Thank you. So, and again, I think we're going to return to the implications of that in a little bit. So another theme that came out in our last show was with that focusing on the stories that students are telling themselves all the time, that mini cycles where they're faced with a challenge and then they successfully complete that and then move on to the next thing is important, on the grounds that do that multiple times and you start to believe and know that you can do it. So it creates this domain specific, so whether it's a maths lesson or science lesson or English, sense of self-efficacy. I can do this, I can complete work to a particular standard, and that's kind of a virtuous cycle. And the flip side is students exposed to multiple failures sort of learn they can't do it. How do you build, is that a valid thing to think about as a teacher? First of all, I will ask my second question first. Is that a valid thing for me to think about when I'm planning my lessons?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a sort of loose area, but confidence and motivation and the environment you're learning in, I would say, is very important for anyone. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think I would add into that sort of providing context for learning. So I'm sure my students get a bit bored, but I'm constantly reminding them of we're going to need 4 or 5 goes to get really good at this skill or this idea. So the first time they get it wrong, that's absolutely understandable. Again, if a teacher's really desperate to, they really want the young people to learn the idea straight away, you can't sort of get cross if they've forgotten it by the next lesson, because that's how the human brain works. We are likely to forget things. So I think explaining to students how learning works, you do get better over time and you do need to practice, which they inherently know, because students who've do music or sports or anything outside of school where you actually have to be good at something, they know you have to practice. You don't play football once or play the violin once and say, yeah, I've done the violin. So they sort of, everyone knows that to get good at something, you need to practice. But I think sometimes in schools, in the desperation to teach the content, or the students want to feel like they've finished or task completion, they do it once and say, oh, I'm done. Students often say, oh, we did that last lesson. And I usually, because I like to see if they have done it, we close all our notes and books and we check to see if they have done it. So students...
And what do you normally find there? Because I guess listening to what you said, it seems fairly simple. And I know that your premise is it happens less than we think. So tell us about that.
Well, the how often they know what they've been taught once, you mean?
Yeah. Because people say, oh, listen, of course I explain things, we repeat it, that's how teaching works. And then you'll say, no, I don't think it happens as much as we think. So I want to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it essentially never happens in entirety. So if you have a class and you taught an idea really well, and in a perfect world, every single student has got the concept that you taught in that lesson, you may have 2 or 3 days, they've had 12 lessons of French and maths and something else before the next science lesson, as well as all the things going on outside of school. It would be like asking a teacher what they did at 2:00 on Tuesday at lunchtime on Friday. Without looking at their planner, they'd have no idea what they did at 2:00 on Tuesday. So when, obviously, it's probably picked up already, I do lots of retrieval as parts of my lessons. I think possibly where I differ from some is I'm not too worried about whether they get the retrieval quiz right or wrong, because, and we discussed this previously, if I'm going to ask the students a similar question 6 or 7 times across the year, I'm sort of going to assume that the first 2 or 3 times they might have got some of it wrong, or at least a small part of it wrong. But as long as I'm providing the answer each time, by the time I get to the 7th, I would like to think, and in my experience, most of the class have grasped that idea. And of course, that is a very low stakes approach, because the students don't have to tell me their score or get very upset they got it wrong, because I always tell them, oh, I'm going to check this again in 3 months, or check this again in 3 weeks. So students who got it right are still thinking, well, I've got to try and keep this bubbling along in my memory. And students who got it wrong always think they've got another chance to get it right next time. Whereas the teach it once followed by a high pressure summative assessment is a very stressful place to be for a young person. Students often tell me in other subjects and other experiences where you get that high pressure summative assessment, which, as you said, they may fail at because they haven't had enough practice. And that, I think, is very detrimental to confidence, and it sort of sucks the life out of the room, in my experience. When you watch that go on, the students, the next topic they learn, as you said before, they are potentially expecting to fail. Whereas if you've gone lots of low stakes retrieval and you keep everything quite relaxed, across 3 months, students often tell me I don't want to sound too grandiose, but it almost seems like magic. They say, oh, I don't know how I knew that. And of course, I know that we've done 7 retrieval quizzes over the past 2 months, so that's why they know it. But they don't, it's almost like the knowledge is just magically in their head. They didn't need to cram, and it wasn't all based on a 1-point summative assessment that told them they were clever or not.
Is there any homework involved in that? Or not really?
So, yes, well, this is controversial, isn't it? From my perspective as an individual, I really don't like homework because I think it's grossly unfair. If you have a class of 25 or 30 students, then some of them will have a lovely home life, nice desk, computer, parents who are very supportive, may have parents who are very knowledgeable about the subject and can help them. Another 5 students in the class will have a very difficult home life. They might be young carers. They might not have access to very good resources at home, if any. And So from my perspective, I don't rely on homework. It's a lovely bonus if you're in a school or a class or have some students who can do extra practice at home, because no one denies more practice will make you better at something. So you can't say homework doesn't work, because if the student can do it, practice will make you better. But I do think it is massively unfair because you can't control a student's home life. You can control what goes on in a lesson and make sure that's as conducive to learning for all the students. And so, yeah, from the way I teach, I've worked in a variety of schools. I follow homework policies, but my homeworks tend to be revision based. And if a student has a horrible home life, or not, it's not always doom and gloom. It could be a student is trying to be a young Olympian and is training 5 nights a week. So I think I've got 6 hours with them at school. I feel like that's enough, 30 hours a week.
And just to clarify, because I guess obviously listeners will teach different subjects, but and lots of subjects will say the exam board is unreasonable, there's too much stuff. GCSE science, triple science, and the dual version, I guess, which are the ones you've taught the most, there seems to be a lot in them. And what I'm hearing is you're saying actually 6 hours a week for a couple of years, or 6 hours a fortnight maybe for a couple of years, you don't need homework to learn that well. Is that what you're saying, or is that not fair?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I can only talk from science, but I talk to lots of teachers from other subjects, and I've watched lots of other subjects go on. And this brings us back to what I said earlier. If you weed out the kind of time fillers in lessons, the copying, the kind of directionless discussions, long assessments which don't give you any more information than a really quick 10-minute quiz, then I feel like there is a lot of time for learning. If you do those kind of padding exercises in lessons, you are relying on kids going home and having to do it themselves in a whole variety of conditions. But yeah, the school day roughly is 6 hours, 5 days a week. That's 30 hours. Now, if I was going somewhere to be trained in a new profession, and I was doing 30 hours a week, and they said, "Oh, you have to go home and do another hour and a half at home," I'd be a bit annoyed. I feel like where possible, teachers, if we're doing really good explanations and we have really good resources, and we're not sort of fumbling around giving wonky photocopies, as professionals, if we're really slick in the lesson, I'm happy to be proven wrong or disagree with people who teach other subjects, but I think that would be a lovely aim, to do it in the school day.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So we've got kind of a big picture, which is you have a very clear idea about what you're doing in the classroom, and then that boils down to practical processes and approaches to what you do when designing courses and uses of homework and other. And you said in passing that students might be bored. I feel like this is like a straw man argument, on the grounds that I think when students are learning and engaging in things, the motivation kind of comes from that. Is that fair or not? Is there an issue with, well, because I'm reducing things down to the bare bones, lessons become less interesting, or is that an unfair challenge?
Yes, I think it'd be interesting to ask my students. I think the way I've been teaching in this way for some time, and we've obviously worked together, and I'd like to think I've got quite a good sense of humour. There are times in the lesson where you just buy yourself time there is time for a discussion at the end of a lesson, perhaps. If the students, I think I aim for a couple of things first, and then we buy ourselves time for some other bits and pieces. So I would say if my explanations are really on point and sharp, I've done 2 or 3 activities where the students have proved to themselves and me that they can do the thing I've told them, and are feeling confident. And you can feel that in the room as you're walking around. The students are all quietly doing the work and feeling quite content, because I've seen the flip side, which is students who are baffled, don't know what they're doing, and as soon as you take their book away from them, they have no idea what just went on for the last half an hour. But I would say if you make the first bit quite efficient, then you give yourself time for the discussion at the end of the class, and the students are actually more relaxed because they know what's being taught that lesson. Whereas potentially, I've seen the flip side where there's a fun discussion, And then there's a mad panic at the end where the teacher says, quickly copy that down. You need to know that. So I think I front load my lessons with really effective methods, get the confidence in the room high. And I could use the word relaxed a lot. I want students to be relaxed and in a position to learn, not stressed that they're missing something or they don't know what's going on.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Into Schools Week, Oak National Academy have announced the appointment of a new interim CEO. This comes as the online school sets a leaving date for its current boss, Matt Hood, now due to step down at the end of March. Director of Product and Engineering John Roberts is named as the temporary leader. Roberts was part of the team that launched the organisation 5 years ago. In the article, Roberts is quoted as saying, "Oak has an important role to play going forward, supporting curriculum standards, tackling workload and innovating using AI." Matt Hood had acted as interim chief executive since Oak became an arm's-length public body in 2022. The recruitment process for Hood lasted a year, and the Department for Education confirmed his appointment to a permanent position in May 2024. Oak have stressed that Hood's permanent replacement will be selected following the principles of the public appointments process. Schools Week reported in November that a judicial review of the decision to turn the Oak National Academy into a government quango had been put on hold due to concerns expressed by other groups that Oak would pose an existential risk to their sector. Oak published its last impact report in October, which said more than 1 in 3 teachers had used Oak resources between February and July last year. Almost 75% said its resources had saved them time over the same period. BBC Tees focuses on the issue of young carers being, in the words of a local head teacher, unfairly marked as late to school as a result of having to drop off siblings. 4 areas in the northeast of England, including Newcastle and Sunderland, have the highest rate of school absences in the country, according to the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. The head of a school in the region spoke to the BBC and said it was unfair to mark child carers as absent because they had responsibilities, such as helping a disabled parent to get out of bed. He went on to say that changes to attendance guidance had created an unfair system, meaning lateness after registers closed resulted in a U mark for an unauthorised absence for a morning session, even if the pupil was only half an hour late. The head teacher went on to say that the reality was that these pupils were at school most of the day. Analysis of the Department for Education figures by the Powerhouse found that the top 9 areas for unauthorised absence were in the north. Northern Powerhouse Partnership CEO said the figures were indicative of high levels of deprivation and an educational north-south divide. A spokesperson for the Department for Education said it had inherited an absence crisis, but was laser-focused on tackling the problem. The Guardian covers a story about a secondary school head teacher who has obtained a court order to be paid damages in the settlement of a legal claim against abusive parents who he alleged launched a campaign of harassment against him. The head teacher was successful in his claim against the parents of 2 former pupils who he said had been harassing him since May 2023. The parents' alleged behaviour included starting an online petition to remove the head teacher from his role and establishing Facebook groups and Instagram accounts which encouraged online abuse against him. The couple were also accused of confronting the head teacher and the school's co-chair of governors outside their homes, although the couple denied this. The legal settlement was reached in January and the couple agreed to pay £10,000 in costs and damages, and agreed to multiple restraining and non-harassment orders. Full details of the story can be found online. Finally, the BBC West Midlands news website reports on a primary school who have begun training pupils in Year 5 and Year 6 to be mental health ambassadors. The school in Wolverhampton has begun teaching a programme to help children manage emotions following investment from West Midlands Violence Reduction Partnership. 20 pupils, including those with special educational needs, are being taught how to be upstanders so they can look out for younger children. Upstanders look out for those who might be being bullied and show that bullying is not okay. The upstanders wear high visibility blue jackets on the playground during break, and younger pupils can ask them for help. The scheme has had a positive impact on the school, says the report. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Because a lot of young people aren't relaxed, either in general or specifically in relation to school. So is there anything within your lessons that you consciously do to help with that? Because you've mentioned it, and I know it happens, but I'm interested in how that happens. How do you make a lesson a relaxed place to be while students are learning a huge amount at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things that I'm pretty clear on in my lessons, and I'm sure lots of teachers do the same, but just removing any fear of being wrong. And I think because I give them key information and there is no sense of, if I do this thing wrong, it's final and fatal. Nothing in my lessons is ever final and fatal. There's always...
So taking away the stakes is one
Yeah.
thing. So rather than like, we've got this assessment, you've got to get it right, it's the last chance. It's then, it's just one time, people get it wrong. You're going to get it wrong sometimes. There's some sort of messing around that. Anything else?
I think, in my experience, showing students the cognitive science side of things. So if you explain to young people how learning works, a lot of, even some year 10 and 11 students, even sixth form students, I'll show them the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, for example, or explain how retrieval practice works. And they are stunned, and you can see them visibly relax. So I say, oh, look, well, this is what we do naturally. This is how our memory works. So, of course, if we told you something 6 months ago, you will have forgotten it if we haven't practiced it. So I think if you're sharing how learning works in amongst the subject, and I'd maybe even bore my students with cognitive science and all the things they're up against. And of course, I'd sort of say I like to think of myself more as a coach than a manager in a classroom. So I'm there to try and get them as successful as they can at that subject. I'm not there as the judge. I mean, I will have to assess them from time to time, but it's all towards a final end game. And I often sort of have the exam board as the big bad wolf at the end of the course. And it's sort of my little class and me getting ready for those final exams.
So a little bit of Ferguson mentality. You create this other enemy that you're working against, and that is the exam board. They're going to throw these at you, and you're going to be ready because you're going to be able to do or know these things. Is that the premise?
Exactly. And I am on their side to that end. So I'm not really interested in the students trying to impress me. I'm a sort of person in the room for those young people to ask for help, because I've been in classes that are very quiet and initially refuse to ask for help, even though they don't know what they're doing. And it's just the more you say, look, I'm on your side, you're going to have to do this on your own in an exam room in 3 months. Now's a good time to ask me where you get stuck. So that, again, plays into the kind of relaxed environment. This is a kind of safe environment to learn in. We're kind of preparing you for the tricky bit at the end of the year.
So is it fair to say the tell for that, because I have this suspicion, because I watch a lot of lessons now in my role, and sometimes in other schools, I always like it when a student raises a hand or even calls out and says, I don't want to sound stupid, but then they say something that is maybe absurd, maybe a big misunderstanding. But I always think, brilliant, this student has learned they can ask that question here. Like, is that something that's valid, do you think? Is that a valid proxy of a room that's working pretty well? Or am I misreading that?
No, I think absolutely. And I always say in science, there is no such thing as a stupid question, because in a subject like ours, where there's so many different sort of hierarchy of models, and I often say the only thing I ever get a little bit grumpy with in class is if a student tries to answer a question and there's a bit of laughing from the other students.
Yeah.
At that point, we have a discussion and say, well, I could stand here and ask you all a really tough question that none of you know, but we're not going to laugh at each other. So absolutely, a room where students can, as you say, like you don't want them all shouting out random things.
So I'll tell you why I'm pushing you on this. It's because I like the advice that you give about teaching, and I'm becoming increasingly aware that sometimes the emphasis upon the bare bones of it, explained clearly, lots of retrieval practice, very clear tasks, very clear resources. Sometimes I find that other teachers who are doing the best job they can, working really hard, see that as kind of a threat to some of the more human sides of what you're doing in the classroom. And I feel like they're still there, but they don't always get expressed. Does that make any sense, or am I just waffling there? I feel like it's worth just emphasising those bits, that sense of getting it right, that creating that classroom environment, creating a room where students feel they can answer questions and ask really absurd ones is kind of integral. And it's not either or, it kind of is part of that whole package.
Absolutely, yeah. So firstly, just as you said, just have the confidence to say anything, because some rooms are very quiet and some, I've worked in a range of schools, and some classrooms are very passive. They feel like their job is not to get in trouble, because if they make any sort of noise, they'll be told off, and we need silence for every single bit. So a room where students are confident enough to ask you a question or ask each other a question, whether it be a really simple question, a daft question, or a really high-level question from one of the brighter students who I'm extending. Because, again, if you don't have that environment, then it's very hard to push the more talented students, because they will just quietly do what you've asked them and sit and relax for a while. Whereas if you have and I think some of it boils down to, I'd say, just doubling back a second, I think if your explanations are really good as a teacher and you're calm, which I think is probably a nice thing for many teachers to try and be, then the students have confidence in you. And that, I think, is another big part of the environment. So if the students are confident in you, they can ask you questions that are off-piste, they can ask you challenging questions, but that, I think they have to have confidence in your ability as a teacher and your subject knowledge, which is obviously quite, I mean, if you've been teaching a while, you can perhaps take that for granted, but being good at explanations and having a wide subject knowledge.
That's a lot to develop, isn't it? It's hard.
It's very tricky for training, and probably the trainees I've worked over the years, that's the hardest bit to get to, is making the students feel confident, because polite students will just politely not ask you any questions because they're worried about embarrassing you, and less polite or more frank students will be quite happy to embarrass someone who's not quite so confident. Yes. So that's very tough, and it's just one of those things. As a trainee, you have to sort of speed up as quickly as you can.
Yes. So last kind of riffing on the intro, and then we're going to come to our questions. There's a book, I think the author's Parker Palmer, who is a kind of educational writer, and I always recommended it when I was doing my RE-BGCE, like 2007, and it's really struck with me. He spent a lot of time across an American school district watching lessons. I think that's the premise of where his experience came from. And he said most classrooms he went into were primarily driven by fear. And he said it's the kids are scared of each other and getting it wrong, and the teachers are scared as well. Do you think that's a dynamic that is that one of the things you're pushing against, do you think, when you're trying to clarify and make things clear and bring in that sense of calm, or am I again I'm coming at it from the wrong angle?
No, I think absolutely. I think there are very few young people I've taught who instantly are very happy to share their ignorance of something and say, oh, sorry, I don't understand that, or can you explain that again? So it's a little bit of human trust, I think, isn't it, that which you build up over time. They've got confidence in you. You explain things well, and I think you need some quick wins in a classroom, because you're right. I think initially there is, I don't know if it's fear or skepticism. There's definitely an awkwardness at the start, because these young people have had a range of teachers, so they don't know what the reaction is going to be. Is it going to be a shouty, strict teacher? Is it going to be a kind teacher who says everything's fine? And you're sort of feeling each other out. But I think, again, sort of going back to the trainees, when you're learning, if you get a couple of really good explanations in and the class go, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. And then when you get to a bit of questioning, the questions are good, the students know the answers because it was explained well, and the teacher interacts with that questioning well and says, oh, that's all the things you're told when you're training with the teacher. don't say no, that's a terrible answer. Always sort of give a polite spin on it. But yes, it's very awkward in the first lesson or two, even for an experienced teacher. And
but the flip side is that momentum. If you get that positive momentum, then that helps, doesn't it, as well? So that's maybe something will come up in our questions. So thank you, because I've kind of, as listeners might know, the first part of the show is kind of questions prompted by the last time, and they're thrown at the guest without any prep. So intriguing responses. And we're shortly going to move on to a few questions about Dan's story, like what he's got into teaching for, what his key challenges are, and others. Before we ask those questions, the first of which is, well, how did you get to here? A brief word from our sponsors. The first being John Catt, who brings you the show today. John Catt Educational are publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. You can level up your professional development and visit johncattbookshop.com, that's 2 T's in Cat, to explore the full range of titles. And a reminder that the discount code JCTTR2425 gives you 20% off your order. And again, a reminder about Teachers Talk Connect. So teachers have the chance to join the Teachers Talk radio team. We're in Manchester on Saturday, the 1st of March, for our biggest ever free event. There is a fantastic range of main stage speakers that includes Lee Parkinson or Mr. P, Kate Jones and Vic Goddard, and there are a range of subject-specific CPD sessions and the chance to network with the kind of teachers that are enthusiastic about their profession because they're there at an event on the weekend to hear more. And there's always a buzz about that sort of thing. Get your tickets for free if you're a teacher or school leader via ttradio.org. Okay, I'm back. So Dan, what's your story? How did you get to here?
So, yeah, I had a little think about this. I'll give the sort of quick version. So, I guess I'm quite a curious guy, and I like lots of different parts of life, and never really knew what I wanted to be. Which is interesting talking to young people. I always tell them I don't know what I wanted to be. I'm still not entirely sure. Maybe there's another career in me, but I did a chemistry degree at school. I then, recurring theme, didn't know what I was going to do. Saw a job advert, became an ethical hacker. So went an IT route, having never done that before. Travelled around the world. That was quite fun. And then about late 20s, it's quite a lucrative business to be in. But I've just
because it was going well, wasn't it? This was successful.
It was going well. And then it was dull, if I'm honest. And I suppose like lots of teachers, I wanted something a bit more fulfilling. My wife was a teacher, and she sort of said in an offhand way, perhaps you should give teaching a go. And I thought, well, why not? I've got my sort of chemistry degree sitting on my CV. So I became a science teacher. And then since then, I've done, with the exception of being in a leadership role at school, I've sort of done most roles, I would say. So I've been head of department, lead practitioner, research lead. As I right at the start said, really love the teaching part of school, and making the lessons and the teachers and the lessons as great as they can be is very much, I'll talk to the cows come home about that sort of thing. I'm a natural skeptic, I suspect, from my science background, so I'm always keen to ask people if they know something's working, which is an unpopular question in schools. And it's often, I've got a spreadsheet, and I'm a bit skeptical about that as well, or they have nothing, in which case it's because schools are hard to measure. There's very few bottom lines in education. There's qualifications, well-being of young people, opportunities. It's very difficult to tie down what schools are doing, actually. So that's always an interesting thing.
So I think your skepticism about things written down applies to the classroom, but also things written down about the school, like policies and official decrees. Is that a fair thing to say? I
think so. And I remember a phrase you came up with, which I really enjoyed, is at school, are we making learning artifacts? So in an effort to produce evidence and accountability, which I absolutely agree with accountability, but I think we need to acknowledge it's really hard to measure. And with my background in IT, I used to do audit as well. And auditing learning is a very, I don't know if it's impossible. It's very tricky. And because it's tricky, I think we often measure the wrong things, and we often get stressed by trying to make it look like learning's taking place.
So we're back to books and spreadsheets, aren't we then? Because they are clear.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the thing. It's the low hanging fruit, because you can't quickly work out whether young people know something or not, even after they've done the final exams, because again, that's only inference based on a selection of the course that was taken. Yeah, on one day.
Okay. So we've got a picture of kind of what drives you in schools. You've got two options. You've got what you're scared of, or what your nemesis are, the kind of challenges to getting done what you think you want to get done in the school. So you can pick either.
Okay, right. So I think what I'm scared of, it's a strange time globally, isn't it? But I think I'm very conscious when I'm teaching young people at the moment about, obviously in the scientific context, of providing evidence, peer review, doing things properly, in a culture of politically that almost being eroded. So what's very scary is trying to get young people, if we're educating them on how to research ideas and make sure you've got data and facts to back you up, in a wider world where everyone's saying that's not so important anymore. So that's probably I don't know if that's a wider concern of mine. It's very tricky to do that at the moment.
Is that noticeably harder now? Have you just noticed a difference in that?
Well, I'm very conscious. If I take a really obvious example, that climate change, no question, is happening. And every scientist in the world will say there's evidence that climate change, global warming and climate change is occurring, in an environment where many countries and leaders are saying, no, it's not. And you can't have a fact-based discussion against a factless system. So that is quite concerning. So I've always grown up with scientists checking what they're doing, reviewing things, improving their model. If something's found out that's new in science, the whole community pivots to the new finding.
My impression is, because I sort of science, I know you disagree, in psychology, that getting students to grasp the scientific approach and the fact that it is inherently iterative and uncertain is hard enough as it is. And it sounds like maybe it's getting harder and the stakes are quite high. Is that fair, or what do you make of that?
I think possibly. Again, there's a few sort of historical points that come up when you're teaching young people about science. Natural selection and evolution is always an interesting area, because you've got obviously being respectful of people and religious ideas. Students are getting a range of information from home. So that's always an interesting area to talk about. Climate change, I think, is a really interesting one now, in that it's, as I say, some global leaders are paving the way for young people quite confidently to say, no, I'm going to drive a diesel car. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's an interesting discussion to have, because I'm a regular science teacher from the local school. It's not, but the president of this country says it's not a thing and we can just carry on. So I think very interesting now.
I feel we can name him. I feel that's okay. But anyway,
yes, there's several from around the world.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes. Okay. And then, are there any smaller scale nemesis in a school beyond kind of the existential threats to existence of humanity?
We'll bring it back to the smaller level. So in schools, I wrote down three things here. There's, one of which we've discussed on many occasions: spurious data. So as soon as a number or grade's gone in a spreadsheet, it becomes gospel and true. And I know the process. I've sort of seen the sausage machine. I know what's going on. So spurious data and all the things that come off the back of it. And the other big one I've got a bit of a beef with now is PowerPoint, because for some time I've been using a tablet. I use an iPad, but any tablet would be fine. And ever since going on a kind of really explicit modelling journey of modelling in front of students, I'm almost allergic to PowerPoint now. So that's my educational nemesis, I would have thought.
Okay, I think we can dig into both of those. So we've got spurious data, such as what, and why is it a problem?
Well, there's a few things I've heard in a range of schools, and some schools I've been in and some schools where I've spoken to colleagues. So predicted grades are inaccurate, but often, as soon as they're put in somewhere substantial, like a spreadsheet, they become something real. They take on some reality. Whereas some teacher, maybe late in the evening, has been asked to put on some data for this year 9 class. And with the best will in the world, it's completely made up. And if you look at other...
Because they don't know, because I know you looked
Yes.
at this before, you looked at accuracy of predictions, and we don't know, do we?
No,
we don't know the grades.
We don't know what if you look at it in a cool light today, we don't know what a teenager is going to do in an exam in 2 years' time, and no one can tell you that they do. It's a delusion at best and a lie at worst. And the example I often give is, who makes money in gambling? The bookmakers. The bookies, on average, lose money, and the bookmakers make money. So teachers predicting grades, we are the gamblers, and we'll always be wrong. So a lot of heartache and effort and time goes into predicted grades. And actually, it's almost a pointless circle, because someone will look at those predicted grades. If they're not what we want to see, it will take a journey through a school and then arrive back at the teacher saying, what are you going to do about it? Now, my take would be just ask the teacher first what they're going to do to teach well. And you could bypass all of that kind of administration and bureaucracy, because actually it's what you do in the classroom that's going to improve the students. And even if the predicted grades are great, why not still trying to improve what you're doing in the classroom? That's the real nuts and bolts of school, is the learning bit. Looking at data has its place. I've got a science background. If I'm measuring the volume of a liquid or the temperature of a reaction, that is real data. Predicted data is, you could, as I say, you're basically analysing gamblers.
And maybe it creates work that distracts from the actual work.
Absolutely,
about that,
and
as well.
It can be misleading for students and parents. It can cause unnecessary worry for those. And again, once it's written down on a paper report, we don't give any sort of confidence ratings there. We think this student's going to get a grade 6, but really we think it's somewhere between a 5 and a high 7. But because someone's written a 6 and it looks a bit more concrete and it looks a bit looks more real, I think it's parents obviously want to know how young people are doing, but I think pulling back on the data is definitely a way to go.
Okay. And then you also mentioned PowerPoints. So is it the tech itself, or what is it that's wrong with using a PowerPoint? Would you say, what's the problem?
So do the quick historical journey of, so early classrooms, you'd have had a blackboard with the teacher writing on the chalk. And then some teachers would have just written some writing up for the students all to copy down as it went up. Then you maybe had a pre-prepared OHP, which the students copied down. And then PowerPoint arrived and teachers didn't have to write it down live on a blackboard. And I think possibly the perfect place is modelling, where, because the PowerPoint, you've got no flexibility. We talk about differentiation, that's sort of gone out of fashion. Now we call it responsive teaching. All of which really boils down to, as a teacher, can you be a bit flexible during the lesson? If the students don't understand, can you go off? And in my experience, PowerPoint it's really inflexible. It's like, well, I'm pressing the space bar. I'm showing whatever's happened in this lesson, I'm hitting the next space bar. And then we're going to do the next thing and then the next thing. So it's very rigid. I think it lends itself to just copying off the board a lot. So it's not the technology itself, because it's fine, but I think it's a process of, I think we termed it the sort of show and hope teaching method, which is you put it on a PowerPoint and hope the students remember it once. And I think that's where I think its limitations lay. I'd like having, as I said, moving to modelling about 10 years or so ago, as soon as the iPad and the Apple Pencil were available, absolutely revolutionised my teaching and lots of my teaching colleagues as well. Real game changer.
Because a lot of people around you will start using iPads or modelling answers because of the impact that it seems to have. So I think we've talked a bit about what it is you think you're doing in the classroom. So I'm wondering about moving to our next question, which is tall tales that maybe you've been told in school, or that maybe you once believed or just accepted. Have you got any examples of those?
Yeah, I had a little think about this. I think the strangest one was at one point, as a CPD session, a teacher from another school came and very confidently told me the best way to teach science was he would get the scheme of work for a subject, for a topic, and he would assign each lesson to a student in the class who would then have to go away and prepare a lesson on that, prepare the lesson on that bit of the scheme of work, and then deliver it for an hour to the rest of the class. And then the second lesson would be the second student in the register. So he had completely outsourced teaching. Now, we know as experienced teachers and people who work with trainee teachers, it's really hard. And he was getting his year 10s to teach each other while he stood at the back and watched and occasionally corrected them. So I remember him very confidently saying, this is flip learning.
This is the
flip
way.
Learning at its best. The kids are really engaged. If they prepare a bad lesson, he rang home to have a go at the parents. So I think that's probably
nice,
the craziest.
Nice to bite back. I'm complaining about your child's teaching. Yeah.
So that was possibly the strangest thing I've ever heard in teaching.
Yes. Okay. We do pick up these along the way. And so teaching can be hard work. It can be challenging. There's lots going on. What keeps you going in it? Like, have you got any things you think, little stories that you are encouraging, or like little tricks you have to keep yourself engaged and, pursuing that, doing as well as you can? Because it's hard sometimes.
It's very hard. And I think my perspective, I remind myself regularly, because it's easy to get sidetracked, is just to really make every lesson as good as it can be. And I'm quite a confident fellow in the classroom, but I'm constantly looking at ways to improve. And again, going back to the skeptical idea, being open-minded to a new idea or a new piece of tech, say, but really challenging it, because we've both seen there's lots of tech for tech's sake. The school's got a budget and they bought something because it sounded good. But you've got to start with your principles of what good pedagogy is and how do young people learn. And those ideas are quite simple, really. So I have a sort of a real drive to make sure every lesson is as good as it can be. Like year 7s in schools, often people write about exam groups, but a year 7 lesson right up to an A-level class, I really try hard to make sure that lesson is the kids enjoy it, the kids learn something. I like that I enjoy it. I think if I've taught a good lesson, I feel good. And if I've, sort of going back to PowerPoint, I've occasionally been given a PowerPoint cover lesson, and it makes me physically feel bad at the end of that hour if I feel like it's a bad lesson and nothing happened. So I try and do all the bits outside the lesson as quickly and efficiently as I can, add data and admin, use tools, use AI as much as I can to help me do that quickly, and then spend as much as I can of the day in the class working with the students. And I often ask them what they think about things, and they're pretty good. They give good feedback. If you ask them, did it help you learn, they'll give you some fairly frank feedback on that.
So that sort of relentless focus on, I want to teach this as well as possible, and any information I can get to improve that, that's what I want to hear.
Yes.
That's what you're open to. And then also, like, in the background, you've got, I'm not doing things unless there's a clear reason for them. And that takes a bit of confidence, doesn't it, as well?
I think so. And it's, yes. Yes, absolutely. It's, I'm quite firm on it. And most of those, if you unpick them or have a sensible discussion with someone, yes, it can be, there's ways to do things that don't take a long time and they get the job done. But we come back to having lots of stakeholders in the school, lots of people, and they've all got their own story, and they all think they're doing their own thing. So we've got to be polite and professional, but minimizing the stuff outside of lessons, for me personally, is very important. And that's what most of us got into teaching for. We just certainly didn't get into it for spreadsheets and data and analysis.
So what I think we have explored in the show is schools can be a bit of a muddle, but often it's less common than we think for lessons to be really focused upon helping students to learn as much as possible in a way that's going to be successful, that to do that takes a lot of hard thinking and pushing some things and ignoring others. And then if you do that, the motivation and the engagement will follow along, because students will start to learn. And kind of slipped into your story about coming into teaching is appealing because of that, the fact that you can gain a real sense of satisfaction from students being introduced to complex new ideas. And we briefly skirted around the existential crisis in relation to, I'm laughing, undermining the nature of science and how we understand it, and that teaching science has a role to play in that as well. So it seems like an important, vital thing. Do you think I've missed any key themes there?
No, I think it's quite wide-ranging. I think you've summed that up.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you've done that very good.
And as always, we're open to questions. So if listeners have questions, they can call in now. Or if you have questions that you'd like to ask Dan or bring up in a future show, then message us via either of the social media channels, and we can answer those as well. We can I'll put them towards Dan or take them on myself, because we're keen to develop that part of the show also. I think it just falls to me to say thanks again to our sponsors, John Catt Education. Reminder, if you enjoyed talking about teaching and pedagogy, listening to one teacher's kind of a deep dive into Dan's approach to teaching and how that works, and you can hear more about that from the talks, both keynote and workshops, at the Teacher Talk Radio show on that March weekend. So you're welcome to attend that. And thanks very much to Dan for giving up your time at the end of a full day of teaching, I believe, to kind of share your thoughts and answers with us today. So much appreciated. Thank you to our listeners. And thanks again, Mr. Borman, for your time and expertise. Enjoy your evenings all, and we'll be back next month with our next guest for Classroom Chronicles. Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.